Hello, welcome to Wearing History. Today we're going over the Sagebrush 1930s blouse, and I'm going to show tutorials for how to make it a little easier to put together since the original instructions are vague. The first step that you should do if you're doing bound buttonholes is to make your buttonholes in your fronts. It has a slight direction here. I have a video online as well. So open up those fronts and then prepare for your bound buttonholes on the correct side. One side will be buttons and one side will be buttonholes. So do that first. After that, if making the version with the collar, you'll attach your facing. Match the notches, and then you're going to sew using the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance down the fronts there, and then you're going to press them, trim them, turn them right side out. So you've got this little bit extra over here that you'll need to turn back and finish at a future point. So just above right there at the yoke, but the other part will be attached to the front. So trim your seam allowance down to about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. And then you're going to prepare for attaching it at the shoulder seams. This method is somewhat different than the original instructions, but I found when doing the version with the collar that it's much easier to do the shoulder seams and the facings first before trying to attach it to the blouse. And you'll see why when they have a nice collar finish at the end. So match your shoulder seams together, matching the notches. The back shoulder seam is a little longer than the front, and that's for movement. It's very, very typical of especially vintage patterns to have the back be a little bit longer. So you're going to have a little bit to ease in. And here you can see the side that needs to be eased in right there. So I matched it about halfway, put a pin in, and then I have a little bit to ease, which I simply do by kind of pressing it with my thumb. Do whatever method works well for you, and then having it again. After this is eased in together, you're going to stitch these using your same 3/8 of an inch seam allowance across. Do both sides and then press those seams open. Now we're going to start on the collar. So the collar is cut on the fold, and you only have one collar piece, which is handy. Fold it up like this, right sides together, and stitch on 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on each side, clip your corners, and turn it right side out. This is what it looks like after the facings have been attached, and this is the collar edge right there. Grab your collar after you've pressed it, and make a little clip at center back, because you'll use that to attach to the center back of the bodice, which is also clipped. Match those 2 points together, and pin it. Now grab that edge of the collar and you're going to put it right up to the other edge. Match that notch, and then the notch of the facing will also match that same notch. So unlike some colors you'll see in other garments, this one actually does overlap at center front, and you can see that if you look really up close on the cover illustration. I forgot to mention that if you want this blouse worn open at the neck instead of closed all the way up, you don't need to do all the buttonholes on the front. You can just do leave the top 2 off. So you're going to pin this all the way across, easing it in to fit between center back and that notch. It's a little tricky always up by the shoulder seam because it sort of does a little angle, so just go slow and then turn it to the other side and check to make sure that your pins are all nice. See, I've got a little pucker there. I'm just going to add an extra pin on this side to make sure that it gets eased in nicely and I don't get any weird tucks. Now take the facing piece, turn it back right there at that line. You want the collar edge to align right up to that stitch line. You're going to match your notches. And then I'm going to switch my pins here so that they're all holding all pieces together. The shoulder edge here is going to get turned back 3/8 of an inch, which is our seam allowance. And then I'm going to match that folded edge right up to the stitch line. So it'll be the center of the pressed open bit. Pin that to place too. And then you have this curve to ease in. So I find it better to match the notches, match the shoulder, and then use that curve that's cut somewhat on a bias to your advantage so you get everything to ease together nicely. Do the same for pinning the other side, and then you're going to stitch this with your seam allowance all the way across. When it's done, it looks like this. So there's my facing, sandwiching the collar together. I call it like a collar sandwich. I don't know why, but There you go. You put it right side out. And look at that nice finish at the collar, especially if you want the turned back collar. That means you don't need bias facing all the way around, but you will need it at center back of the neck. So you've got this extra bit of seam allowance here. You're going to trim that to 1/8 of an inch and then use a little bias facing. I do have tutorials on my blog for bias facing, so I'm not going to go over it here, but I'll add a link in the video description. You're going to press these now to make them nice and flat. After it's pressed, it looks like this. I've also turned under the raw edges on my facing. It looks nice and smooth, everything matches really well. And now you're going to finish those buttonholes if you're doing bound buttonholes on the back side, and then do your buttons. Well, you can do the buttons last, actually. Now you're going to lap this, center front lines matching. Mine's marked here in pencil. Obviously you don't want to do that on your finished one, so use whatever method will come out in the wash, or use a thread basting to mark center fronts. But that center front is super important because you need to lap those one over the other. Now I'm just easing it up, and I am going to make sure that I have it nice and smooth, so I'm pinning this to place. Now you're going to stitch 3/8 of an inch all the way around, and this is going to mark where you're going to turn it under. This is very, very helpful when we do our lapped seam. But before we do that, you need to make sure you clip in at those corners. This is marked on the pattern for you. You want to make sure that you clip it not quite to the seam line exactly, but enough so that you can get that corner to turn under nicely. If you go past that, then it's going to fray, so make sure you don't go past the stitch line. Now I'm thinking about how I'm going to finish this, so I'm going to clip that to free it just on one side. Don't get the front, that would stink. And turn this under 3/8 of an inch, and then press this and hand stitch this to place. Now I'm going to turn those up towards the inside to prepare for my lapped seam. So I'm just turning it on my stitch line. Make sure your stitch line matches the color of your fabric, because it would really stink to have a visible line of stitching that doesn't match your fabric. Okay, now the fronts. So you're going to make your little tucks at the front. You're going to pleat it on that solid line and bring it to the dotted line, so make sure you select the right line for your size. I have mine marked here in pencil. Like I said, make sure it comes out in the wash of whatever you use. Test it on a scrap first. And I'm just going to finger press this and then lap it like this. The reason we do this is so that it'll have a visible line of stitching, which was really popular in the 1930s. You could also just do it as a regular tuck, but you don't have to. After these are pinned to place, like you'll see up close here, I'm using my fingernail to kind of press it. That's called finger pressing a bit. And then you match it to that line, you pin this to place, and then you're going to stitch it from the very end of the dart all the way up to the top, using that folded edge as a guide. So I do about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch on both of the tucks. That's a neat visible line of stitching like this. Make it match your fabric. Unless you really want contrast, then go for it. Now you're going to take the prepped piece of the front yoke. You're going to match that center front line again. Like I said, it's a super important marking line, so make sure it's marked on the front blouse also. Match those center fronts together and pin that to place. Now we're going to ease this curve, which can be a little tricky. So to make the lapped seam, you're going to align the cut edges together and then lap it to the stitch line. So I'm aiming for 3/8 of an inch in from the cut line on the blouse, and that will align to the folded edge of the front yoke. If you don't know where this is, you can also run a basting line on the front blouse and then just match that folded edge up to the stitch line that you did, and then remove that stitching after you're finished. The corner here is a really important marking point, so make sure that you mark this well. Also, like I just showed while I was talking, make sure you match those notches. Then ease everything into place. The exact cut line of the fabric is not as critical as making it align nice and smoothly. And obviously you don't want to make it too small, so make it as close to the cut line as possible. But depending on your fabric, things can shift a little bit and it can be more tricky. In something stable like this cotton muslin, it's a lot easier because it retains its shape. So if you're using something like a flowier fabric, you're going to really want to take your time, and you're going to want to stay stitch the blouse for sure along the curves so that you can get things to ease together really nicely. Going across the shoulder is quite easy. There's a little notch there to match. So I have one side pinned now, and you want to make sure it lays really nice and smooth with no puckers, no pulls, or anything like that. That's what it looks like when it's done. Now you're going to top stitch very close to this edge, between 1/16 and an 1/8 inch away from the folded edge. Go all the way across. I pivot on my needle at that point to get it nice and crisp right there at the point of the shirt. After this, turn it right sides out. Right sides together, and match those notches. Sew those side seams using 3/8 of an inch. If you have a slightly larger waist, you may need to add a little placket on the side just to give yourself some ease to get it on over your head. It also runs a little bit narrow in the hips, so it's very important to make a mock-up even though it's relatively unfitted at the waist. It was the narrow 1930s hips. So thank you very much for watching. You can get this pattern on my Wearing History Etsy and wearinghistorypatterns.com.